Well, let's continue. I have told, we basically talk on well, the process which led the European economy to expand to the American continent. And by the way, American continent at the time also contained many microsystems, but there were some, again, centers which were controlled by them, which were part of the European economic system. Um, and and certain regions, for example, especially in Brazil, it's very famous. I mean, they say the Portuguese cling to the coastal line like crabs. They can never go to the inland, and for a very long time, this was the case. Actually, I mean, the inland was mostly belonging to the natives, and only later the inland was taken to some extent from them. Uh, but anyway, well, uh, under the Dutch hegemony, the trade between the uh, rest of the world, but also with the American continent and Europe, has developed more, and the cities, the influences of the trade center penetrated further. And something interesting has happened at the time actually. Um, Something called nation state it emerged. Well, according to there's actually an article on that, on nations and states and how basically they are contrasted with each other and how they merged basically into one. Basically, the major states that were controlling large areas like France or England, they controlled many different cities and independent, again, towns and villages, which did not have the feeling of belonging to one single entity, which was France. Same for England. As those trade centers becomes more developed, at least some trade centers, major big ones, had started to develop this feeling. So French people and the English people, starting with the 14th and 15th century, increasingly they begin to feel that the people living within this one state belong to one group of people. But that feeling was relatively not deep penetrated into the cities, into the and into the land in general. I mean, many towns, this feeling was not that strong. This feeling of Frenchness, this feeling of being English was not that strong. At least as not that as strong as feeling that we are one nation. We should organize each other as a nation. Um, the state was the main organizing power. People were still trusting to the state and the head of the state and the state mechanisms, but the feeling of a nation, feeling of the trust to the different elements within the nation, that was relatively weak at the time. Uh, on the other hand, there were some small areas, especially the city states, where the members of it have this feeling of belonging to one single community. I mean, people of Athens, for example, in the hand of the rulers, they feel being from Athens is something that binds them. All Athenians are building a society, for example. Same thing for Venice, same thing for Florence, and even for example, France, certain trade centers, these feelings was starting to some extent develop. People from Lyon, people from Köln, for example, and a special type of case. Well, mostly this feeling of being a nation, being in an extended area, being part of a single society, was something usually. I mean, there were small entities where people were feeling as one society. You might call as a nation, although not nation in today's sense, but a much smaller sense, Athenians, for example. And there were states that were much larger, but people of them were not feeling as nations. But in 14th and 15th centuries, in certain states, large states, people started to feel as part of nation. France and England first, but then it spread to also some other areas. Maybe the first place where this was kind of developed was Dutch area, where different parts of Dutch started to feel also that we belong also to a single entity, the Dutch state, Dutch nation. So because it was relatively small relatively small, Dutch nation is sometimes called as a proto-nation. I mean, it's not nation as we understand. It is a smaller entity. More people, the entities within the nation, different, let's say, regions within the state were much more connected. I mean, it's kind of close to city-state in some ways, but it's also larger than cities, typical city-states. So it is somehow between the larger nation-states and smaller city-states. So it's sometimes called Dutch proto-nation. In other places, as the trade networks develop, as trade centers starts to penetrate, as different more centers in France, England, Germany, Spain become more and more dependent to the European world economy. Basically, this dependency, this exchange of first the economic exchange, but then of course cultural exchange and connection and communication between the people started to increase this feeling of the nationhood. So, in a way, increasingly throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, this the people living in states, Western European states, increasingly started to form nations. So and a special type of state called nation states, the states that belong to a nation, started to form. I mean, previously, a state doesn't necessarily belong to a nation. It can contain many nations, for example. And it doesn't say, we as a state belong to this particular group, and we are the people who are living under us are one society. Nation, usually states don't claim that, even if we can claim that they were kind of like nation states in the past. Even Egypt doesn't necessarily, or Babylonia necessarily don't claim that, basically. Even though, the connection between the people living under these states were relatively more developed. So they might kind of be taught as early nation states, Egypt and Babylonia, but still, the sense of being one people, which actually owned the states, and the state was actually their state primarily. This feeling was relatively more, a feeling that developed in West. In full sense, at least in the Western European European economy. Still, of course, we might ask whether some primary examples of this feeling, this type of state exists, and it's interesting to look at also. Anyway, as basically this nation states start to form, the merchants of these nation states connected with the bureaucracy, the state power, the army, the state organizations, they started to apply certain certain tactics to challenge Dutch's ability to control the trade network. As I said, usually states were mainly aiming to control the land, but now states and the nations, the merchants that are living in the states, they organize together to also control the trade networks, the capital, the buying power between the different parts of this trade network. At that time, of course, they were not able to challenge Dutch wherever Dutch merchants go. They were able to provide more variety of goods, and they were able to. They kind of were better merchants at the time, but both England and France tried to rival Dutch by claiming a territory, an area, which might be, and in that sense, I mean, state and merchants come together, which were some of that area was their colonies, some of the area were client states of these countries, and in that area, the trade were as much as possible. Of course, certain goods need to be imported from rest of the Western European trade network, but as much as possible, this area trade within itself. In a way, they partially withdraw from the world economic system. And as these different parts of the world economic system withdraw, I mean, their participation in the greater world economic system decreased. This, of course, made the trade more costly. Partially, I mean, this was the reason why in the 18th century the world economic system enters to a crisis. And at the same time, UK and France both aim to control the trade networks and also become dominant power organizing the world economy. To some extent, also France was aiming to at least consider territorial expansion and control more areas. To increase the power of the state at the same time. So it was kind of more in the middle way of traditional empire, traditional. I mean, it was in a way applying tactics of a state which was trying to expand its territory, but at the same time also tactics of a trade center which was aiming to, increase its control over trade networks. So this UK-France rivalry continued through to some extent 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and after the Napoleonic Wars, England won, and England became the hegemonic power, or new hegemonic power of the world economic system. And at the same time, now we have a hegemony which is much larger, a whole country, and the size of trade networks were developed a lot, and basically it was able to produce major products in much larger scales. And this ability of these additional markets was also connected with the Industrial Revolution, but many of the basic industrial revolutionary, industrial processes were known also before, although the fine machinery was produced relatively lately, but we might also argue why they produced at that particular time. And also, of course, the fact that the trade centers become so powerful also make the agricultural centers to serve those trade centers to provide, the industrial agricultural products like cotton, for example, and they also had this mass labor force which they can use for in the industry. So as a result, this first industrial revolution, this dominance of industry, has started in England, and increase in mass of production using the power of steam and coal, basically, started in England. And England has become the industrial center of the world. So we will continue in the next part.